Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the second half of our sessions today. I'm Ken Gallagher. I will be moderating the next two sessions. And before I hand it over, just want to remind you, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Stephanie and Sarah have said that we will answer those questions when we get to the end of this particular session. So I'm going to go ahead right now and turn it over to Stephanie, I believe. You guys can introduce yourselves and go ahead and you can take control now of the slide deck, Stephanie.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me get settled here. Take control. Okay, can everybody see me, hear me, and see the presentation? Yes, it looks good. Great, thank you. Hello, and thank you everyone for joining the Floodplain Variance session. So the previous presentations in this track have talked a bit about variances. And piggybacking on top of that, this presentation will provide an overview about the National Flood Insurance Program with a focus on floodplain variances, including what it is, when to grant one, an overview of the National Flood Insurance or NFIP, what specific NFIP criteria needs to be included in variances, and more. I'm Stephanie Frechette. I'm a floodplain management coordinator here at the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development within the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. I'm new to the program. I've been here a couple months. Prior to coming here, I worked at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services for several years, where my work included assisting municipalities on ensuring compliance with emergency planning and security requirements. Presenting with me today is my coworker, Sarah Thunberg, who's also a floodplain management coordinator here at the Office of Planning and Development. She's been here for a year and prior to that worked at the National Weather Service. Our role as the State Floodplain Management Program coordinators is to implement FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program to the local level of participating communities. In New Hampshire, we have approximately 94% of communities participating in this program, where they have agreed to incorporate minimum floodplain management regulations into their ordinances, and in return, flood insurance through the NFIP program is made available to residents in that community. Oops. Okay. So here's the agenda for the session. Today's presentation will be an overview of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is the program driving most of the floodplain regulations here in New Hampshire. We will discuss the community floodplain regulations and ordinances, floodplain variance criteria that ZBAs should be aware of, sample scenarios, common situations when a floodplain variance may be needed, and wrap up with a session summary and resources. We hope this information today gives you a basic understanding of floodplain variances, when to grant them, and considerations to keep in mind when you are thinking of requesting one. So let's get started. Starting with an overview of the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. This is a program that was created by Congress in 1968. It's a voluntary partnership between FEMA and participating communities, where the main goals and objectives of this program is to reduce loss of life and property, reduce disaster relief costs, increase the importance of hazard mitigation, restore and protect floodplains, and make federally backed insurance coverage available. The NFIP is often referred to as a three-legged stool, as there's three main components of this program, which include knowing your risk by looking at floodplain mapping, reducing your risk by adopting floodplain management regulations, and insuring your risk with flood insurance. As I said, approximately 94% of communities in New Hampshire are actively participating in this program. Every state has a coordinating office that works closely with FEMA, and in New Hampshire, it is the Office of Planning and Development, which is Sarah and myself, to coordinate the program and implement it at the local level. And the way it works is for a community to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, they agree to adopt and enforce local floodplain regulations that meet the minimum NFIP requirements that are set forth by FEMA. And in return, flood insurance is then made available for purchase for all property owners and residents, including renters, that are in that participating community, whether or not they are in the floodplain area. This shows a map of the participating communities in New Hampshire. We have 220 communities that participate, which are displayed in white, and the ones in orange and yellow currently don't participate. So the majority, 94%, are participating communities. So that means that those communities do have a floodplain ordinance, and that ordinance contains language on floodplain variance criteria, and flood insurance is available to all those residents in those communities. So we talked about the importance of knowing your risk. Now we'll talk about some resources that are produced by FEMA, which is the flood insurance rate map and the accompanying flood insurance study. So what are these exactly? The flood insurance rate map is an official map of a community that's produced by FEMA, showing the delineated special flood hazard areas and the base flood elevation and the risk premium zones that are applicable to that community. And the flood insurance study is a report that's prepared by FEMA that summarizes an analysis of the flood hazards in a community. And the study is used to prepare a flood map that shows the flood hazards in that community. So pictured here are 3 different types of maps. And as you can see, the quality among each of them varies. Most communities have maps looking like the one in the back with blue areas labeling zones that align with language in the floodplain regulations regarding how susceptible an area is to flooding. Over time, land development and changes in weather patterns alter how the water flows through the floodplain. And as modeling techniques and data collection improves, FEMA will update those flood insurance rate maps accordingly to reflect the new hydrologic conditions. FEMA is currently in the process of remapping the floodplains across New Hampshire through the risk map process, and a newer version of the maps will be coming out in the coming months and years across communities in New Hampshire. So once FEMA finishes the mapping update process, all communities will have updated maps with more details showing flood zone information, like how you see on the map on the left. The maps show the 1% annual chance flood, which is the national standard used by NFIP for regulating new development and flood insurance requirements. Some people may know this as the base flood or the 100-year flood, but we try to get away from that terminology just because it can be a little bit confusing. People think that once they have a flood, a 100-year flood, they're not going to see a flood again of that magnitude for 100 years, when in fact it's a 1% chance in any given year that a flood of that magnitude can occur. The area of this 1% annual chance flood on the flood insurance rate map is called the special flood hazard area. Another term we use a lot is the base flood elevation. This is the height that the floodwaters are expected to rise to during the 1% annual chance flood. The numbers are rounded to the nearest whole foot on the map, but they can go to 1/10 of a decimal for permitting purposes. The rounding is for insurance purposes, and this is an important number because the community floodplain regulations require that the structure's lowest floor for new construction and the substantial improvement must be elevated to this base flood elevation number. So we defined a few of those basic terms that we use a lot, and now we're gonna go through some background information on community floodplain regulations and ordinances to enforce those regulations in your communities. For a community to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, they must adopt and enforce the minimum standards. These minimum standards come from the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 44, Section 60.3. Adopting and enforcing the minimum standards is not only a requirement to join this program, but also for the community to remain in good standing with the program. All 220 communities in the state have adopted a floodplain ordinance that contains the minimum NFIP standards, including the required variance criteria. There are many communities in the state that go above and beyond these minimum requirements, so they enforce what's called a higher floodplain standard. We have it in our statute, RSA 674-56, flood hazards, that allows municipalities to adopt floodplain ordinances as part of their enrollment in the National Flood Insurance Program. The statute talks about how the floodplain ordinances are adopted as if they're zoning ordinances under RSA 674-16 and 17. Municipalities may adopt floodplain ordinances either as an amendment to their existing zoning ordinance or as a separate ordinance. The statute says that because the floodplain ordinance is a type of zoning ordinance, the municipality needs to have a board of adjustments associated with it. If a municipality has adopted a zoning ordinance either before or after the adoption of the floodplain ordinance, then the board of adjustment should be the same for both. So we'll take a look at the similarities and differences between a floodplain ordinance versus a zoning one. Both a floodplain ordinance and a zoning ordinance involve land use regulation and control. Both have benefits and performance expectations, and both are implemented under the same statutory authorities at the local level. The main difference between them is regarding how they address human safety and property protection in relation to a known natural hazard like flooding. So the main difference is that the floodplain ordinance uses the FEMA map to delineate the floodplain, and this is used to address human safety and property protection in relation to a natural hazard. So here we'll get into floodplain variance, the definition, intent, and considerations. A variance is defined as a grant of relief by a community from the terms of the floodplain management regulation. These variances are meant to address a unique, a site-specific, and individual circumstance where the strict application of the ordinance may result in a hardship to the property owner. So it's a special relief from the rule if the regulation were to impose a hardship to a property owner. Things to be aware of is that granting a variance can result in a project that doesn't meet the minimum standard of the NFIP. It can result in a property owner with a flood insurance premium for a non-compliant structure because the variance is not a consideration when it comes to the insurance premium. It can result in a risk to life and property, and therefore variances from flood elevation requirements or other floodplain management requirements should be granted only rarely. There's only unique situations and circumstances when it should be granted. So we just want to make you aware of the variance criteria later on for if you do need to grant one. There are specific variance criteria in our state statute, and here we'll talk about the criteria as it relates to floodplain management. The next few slides will discuss consideration in terms of the hardship, increased risk, minimum action, and the key issues for communities to consider. Regarding considerations to property hardship, a variance is related to the land and topographical conditions of the property, but it's not related to the individual personal circumstances of the applicant. It's related to the property. It is not shared by adjacent parcels of land. It is required by the applicant to make reasonable use of the property, and it should not be granted if the problem could be resolved through other means. So again, there's only unique situations and circumstances when a variance should be granted due to some of the risks involved. So if there's an opportunity to work around the variance by doing the activity outside versus inside the floodplain, then that's what should be done. There's an increased risk associated with issuing variances. For example, if a variance is issued, then choosing to build within the floodplain may impair adjacent properties or neighborhoods by causing floodwaters to go onto their property. So as you consider the increased risk of a variance, it shouldn't result in a detriment to public health, welfare, or safety. The point of a variance is to offer a relief to an existing floodplain management regulation when there is no other option. The variance allows a deviation from the overall zoning ordinance and should deviate as little as possible, as minimal as possible to afford the necessary relief. Some of the key issues for communities to consider are the community's liability. So if a variance is granted, a community should be documenting that variance, especially if a flood occurs, which causes damage. Documentation is a community's only protection after a flooding event that causes damage, so make sure that you're keeping documentation. Another consideration is the cumulative impact of issuing multiple variances. If a community grants multiple similar variances, then it can trickle downstream to the community and affect other adjacent property owners and communities. So therefore, issuing multiple similar variances can have that snowballing effect. The variance decision lasts for the life of that structure. So if the variance is offering relief on a structure built within the floodplain, and if it's not done correctly, the variance will be open for the life of the structure, which means it can be active for a long time. Another consideration is whether granting a variance may result in a community jeopardizing their status as a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program. One role of the state and FEMA through administering this program is occasionally going out to communities and talking to them about their permitting process, about whether any variances have been issued for their floodplain regulations. So we would look at the permitting applications and the variance applications. And if during this visit, FEMA were to determine that the community is not meeting their responsibilities, then that could result in suspension from the program. And as far as I'm aware, I haven't heard of this happening in New Hampshire. We try to work with communities on resolving these issues, but it's something to be aware of, paying attention to the reasons for your variance and how often you're requesting and granting them. And remember, they should only be issued under rare special circumstances, which Sarah will talk about in a bit. And now I'll hand it over to Sarah to talk about the floodplain variance criteria.
Alrighty. So I know we've kind of been talking about variances a lot today, so some of this might be repeating what you've already heard today, but we're trying to talk about this stuff from a floodplain variance perspective because Floodplains come with inherent risk. And so variances inherently will increase some risk associated with a structure built in the floodplain, where if that structure did not get the variance granted and was able to follow all of the floodplain requirements, that structure would be at less of a risk if it was built fully compliant. So that's why we think it's very important to talk about the variances today, or floodplain specific variances today. So it is important to keep in mind what the intent of granting a variance is. So in terms of floodplain management, the variance criteria in the NFIP regulations are to provide specific floodplain management input to the community criteria for approving variances. They are used to inform participating communities of the FEMA guidelines for evaluating local compliance with the standards required for participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. The variance criteria is also intended to ensure appropriate notification of the issuance of a variance and to advise applicants and future owners of potentially high flood insurance rates. So these criteria will often be found within the zoning ordinance, or if your community has a standalone floodplain ordinance, they will be found there, generally at the end of the floodplain management or floodplain development section. So the ordinance language, or the floodplain ordinance variance language say that any order, requirement, decision, or determination of the building inspector or other permitting authority made under this ordinance may be appealed to the Zoning Board of Adjustment as set forth in RSA 676.5. So again, and we've said this many times today, but the variances must not result in any additional threats to public safety or create nuisances. So the local flood damage prevention ordinances and minimum NFIP requirements are intended to help protect the health, safety, and well-being and the property of local citizens. So variances that allow the construction of habitable areas below the base flood elevation, especially in high hazard areas such as floodways and areas adjacent to the coastal zone V, they all increase the risk to life and property of both the occupants and emergency services personnel. The potential for loss of life is greatest in structures where the lowest floor is below the base flood elevation and where flood depths are greater than 3 feet or where there is high velocity floodwater present. So extraordinary public expensive may include protection and/or repairs to structures, time and materials expended by emergency service personnel, and the expense involved in operating disaster assistance programs. So the cost to communities can include publicly funded emergency flood protection measures such as sandbags and temporary flood walls used to protect structures exposed to flooding as a result of the issuance of a variance. Also accommodation of time and equipment expended by emergency services personnel to evacuate an area or rescue occupants of the flooded structures. So there are some specific intents for, or specific language for floodways. And the intent of this variance criteria is to prohibit the development that may increase flood levels, which in turn can increase potential flood damage to the development and to structures of other property owners adjacent to the area. In most cases, alternative locations for the proposed development are available outside the limits of the floodway. And other actions may also be taken to or be required as a condition of approval to compensate for increased flood levels, such as requiring the applicant to install flood control measures to accommodate the increased discharge. Additionally, the burden of proof rests on the applicant or the developer, not FEMA or the local community, the state or other agencies, to demonstrate that that scientific data were used to determine that no increase in flood levels would result from the proposed development. And when I say no increase in flood levels, I mean not even an inch. There is no increase in flood levels allowed. So sufficient proof may include, but is not limited to, studies provided by an appropriate licensed professional, whether that's a surveyor or an engineer. Generally, a community may prohibit variance requests based on 3 potential flood hazards in the floodway. The hazard to the development itself, the increased hazard to development that may cause other properties, or that may cause damage to other properties, and the risk to individuals stranded in isolated structures surrounded by what is in many cases rapidly flowing, debris-laden floodwater, and the risk to rescue workers. So, what is the floodway? Just in case you're not aware of what it is. So in our floodplain maps, this is the picture on the right is generally what you will see at as the mapped floodway for a river. This dash or striped area in red and blue is the main channel of the river, which is the area that is reserved in order to discharge the base flood without increasing the surface water elevation. So that is where you're going to be finding the fastest moving water during the 1% annual chance flood. And there typically are many much more stringent building restrictions for building in the floodway for 3 reasons. 1, the channel of the river or adjacent water course and adjacent land areas must be reserved in order to discharge the base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than a designated height. And in New Hampshire, our designated height is none. There must be no increase in water surface elevation. So that's just kind of a little overview of what floodways are in case you are not aware. Typically, in New Hampshire, since our floodplain regulations are kind of, there are minimum regulations, but communities may elect to have higher than the minimum floodplain regulations. And there are many communities in New Hampshire that just prohibit development in the floodway 100%. Even if you could come up with a study to show that it's not going to have any effect on the base floodwater elevation, it's still, those communities deem it too risky. And that's also because during a during the 100-year flood, you could potentially have entire trees flowing down the river very quickly. That can have a lot of force behind it. And so if there's any kind of structure in the floodway, that tree's gonna act like a battering ram flowing down the river. And so it's generally just a good idea to stay away from developing in the floodway. All right, so a variance, or when we're granting variances, the community, the variance must be the absolute minimum needed to minimize the reduction of, or to minimize or reduce future flood damage and to also still relieve the hardship. For a variance request to waive the elevation requirement, the community review board must require the minimum necessary actions. For example, if an applicant can justify a variance from the requirement to elevate a building utilities above the base flood elevation, the Zoning Board of Adjustment should still require as much elevation as possible to provide some amount of flood risk protection or risk to adhere to the intent of the floodplain ordinance. All right, so just like any other regular variance, the Zoning Board of Adjustment must notify the applicant in writing that the issuance of a variance will result in increased flood insurance premium rates and that the construction below the base flood elevation will increase risk to life and property. Not only is it important for the current property owner, but also it's important for the future property owners because again, as Stephanie said, the variance exists for the length of the structure. Even if one owner or the original owner decided that they were okay with that risk and they just went ahead with a variance and developed, say they had a basement in the floodplain where there shouldn't have been one, the next owner will inherit that risk. And so it's really important to make sure that all of the, sorry, skip slides there or mistakenly. Yeah, it's just very important to make sure that you notify all future owners of any variance so that they can make the educated decision on whether or not they want to spend some extra money and maybe bring the structure into full floodplain compliance. All right, so next I'm going to talk about some common situations where a floodplain variance may be needed. And a floodplain variance would be okay if it was done correctly. So I'm first going to start out with reasons to not grant a variance because you might get applications for a variance based off of some of these reasons, which can include personal convenience or aesthetics. Say that a community or the homeowner they don't have the money to fully raise a structure or bring the structure into compliance. That unfortunately is not a good enough reason because of the inherent risk associated with floodplain development. Also, aesthetics is not a good enough reason to grant a variance. Say that in the picture that I have here, the house on the left could be what all of the other houses in the neighborhood look like. And then there's one house that is, for some reason, their elevation might be a little bit lower and they need to raise their house to be up above the base flood elevation. And aesthetically, this could look a little not great. It could be a bit of an eyesore, but it is safe. And so aesthetics, structure just standing out against the neighboring buildings is not a good enough reason to justify increasing the risk of that structure. All right, so another situation where you should not be granting a variance, and this is a tricky one. So frequently, after there has been a disaster, there is a lot of rebuilding to do, and there can be pressure from homeowners or just other people to repair quickly, and people want to move back into their houses, and I get that, I understand that. But there are certain things that need to happen after there's been a disaster. So there is something called a substantial damage determination. You might have heard of it. So this is a requirement by FEMA to, if there is a structure in the floodplain that has been damaged by more than half of its value, the community is expected and responsible for making a determination of whether or not the damage was actually 50% of the market value. So that would, you would make that determination by getting some quotes and estimates for how much repairs are going to cost to bring the structure back to the condition it was before it was damaged. And then generally on your building permit application, the community might review the expense of the repairs with the value of the house. And if it's close to 50%, the community might ask for a very detailed breakdown of all the expenses, just to make sure, because they're at, if your house or structure is determined to be substantially damaged, FEMA will require that structure to be rebuilt to the current floodplain regulations. So even if your house was built 100 years ago, before there were even mapped floodplains, your house might have been grandfathered into the floodplain program and not required to be elevated to what a new house would be required to do. But if your house gets substantially damaged, you are required to elevate or do some mitigation so that your house would be fully compliant as if it was a new building. So this substantial damage determination can take a long time, and there have been times where the pressure from communities or pressure from residents, also just the financial hardship of doing it, can lead communities to want to grant a variance for the requirement for a substantial damage determination, or the requirement to elevate to the current floodplain regulations. That is not a wise thing to do, because this essentially maintains the risk of the structure. It does nothing to decrease the flood risk, and so it's very likely that emergency responders are going to have to revisit this property again, because it will likely flood again. If it's flooded once, it's probably going to happen again. And if nothing has been done to mitigate the structure, people are going to stay at risk. So yeah, to waive a substantial damage determination is not a good reason to grant a variance. And I understand that administratively it can be a lot of work. And there are some FEMA assistance available for maybe hiring a part-time staff to help out with doing the determinations. But FEMA does, you are expected to perform substantial damage determinations as a participating community of the National Flood Insurance Program. All right, so that's enough of when not to grant a variance. Let's actually get into situations where a variance would be appropriate. So variances are most commonly granted for accessory or agricultural structures. These generally are non-residential structures with low risk and damage potential. Because you're not, if you have a flash flood in the middle of the night, if it's a non-residential structure, hopefully, ideally, nobody's going to be sleeping there and be surprised and their bed is floating down the river. That ideally would not be happening with these structures. So they are generally determined to be low risk, low damage. The variances should only be used after all other floodproofing and compliance options have been exhausted. All right, so what is an accessory structure? For floodplain management purposes, accessory structures are structures that are on the same parcel of property as the principal structure, the use of which is incidental to the principal structure. It must be only used for parking or storage. And it must be small, no larger than a 1-story or 2-story car garage. And 1-story 2-car garage, sorry. And represent minimal investment by the owners. And again, have low damage potential. Now, agricultural structures are exclusively used for agricultural purposes or uses in connection with the production, harvesting, storage, raising, or drying of agricultural commodities and livestock, including some structures used for aquaculture, which are considered agricultural structures. All right, so under the minimum NFIP regulations, these accessory and agricultural structures are required to either elevate or have dry floodproofing or for non-residential structures. Now, dry floodproofing is where the whole structure remains watertight. So there is no water that can get into the basement or the lowest floor or anything. Generally, this can include putting like panels by the doors, as opposed to wet floodproofing, which I'll go over in a minute. All right, so FEMA generally recognizes that there are types of construction and materials used in many agricultural structures and accessory structures that inherently mean that they have low damage potential. They're light, they're not made out of concrete most of the time, and that gives them gives them a low damage potential. So wet floodproofing tends to be the more popular of the floodproofing options. It is where you use materials and construction techniques that allow structures or portions of the structures to intentionally flood. That is to allow the floodwater to enter these areas to counteract what's called hydrostatic pressure on the walls and buoyancy from the hydrostatic uplift forces. So that's a lot of science words. So what that means is let's say, for instance, you're in the floodplain and you have a basement. When the flood comes, there's going to be a whole bunch of water flowing up the sides of your house. Let's say like 2 feet up the sides of your house. that water has a force. It's pushing on the walls of the foundation. And if there's nothing, like if the basement is all air, there's nothing to push back against the force of the water. And that can lead to your foundation actually cracking and crumbling and compromising the structural integrity of your house. So there are things called flood vents, which they're installed very close to the ground, and they let water into the basement to intentionally flood the basement so that you have water on the inside and the outside, and the pressure forces will equalize. And there, in that case, then there's much less of a risk of your foundation being compromised. So that is why sometimes it is good to flood your basement. But when you have flood vents, you also want to make sure that you have some kind of sub pump in your basement to remove the water after the flood has receded, because eventually you are going to want to use your basement, not as a swimming pool. So yeah, although the enclosure interiors and contents get wet, wet floodproofing tends to reduce the risk of structural damage much better than dry floodproofing does. So this is just a little diagram showing wet floodproofing. So here are what I call the flood vents. So generally it's right up against the ground. So this is where the ground surface would be. And if you have a floodwater that is up to this dashed line, then it will allow water to flow in. And notice also how the water heater and utilities have been elevated above the flood opening levels, so that if you do have the water flowing in, it's not going to ruin all of your utilities. That's a very important thing to note when doing a wet floodproofing option. Alrighty, so some variance factors to consider for accessory and agricultural structures. They must be for individual structures, and the justification has to be on a case-by-case basis. You also want to document the floodway encroachment provisions in the local floodplain management regulations, and make sure that those are satisfied when structures are proposed to be in the floodways. You want to check to make sure that if you are planning to build in the floodway, that you are in a community that allows floodway development. You also want to confirm that the proposed accessory structures are small, they represent minimal investment, have low damage potential, and that agricultural structures have low damage potential. Again, they meet the exclusive use requirement and will be restricted to such exclusive uses, such as parking and storage. You also want to verify that the proposed structures will meet the following wet floodproofing design and construction requirements. Verify that applicants includes descriptions of the exceptional hardships that they would experience if variances are denied. You also want to document that the variances provide the minimum relief necessary, and if feasible, require consideration of combining elevation with wet floodproofing or dry floodproofing. Generally, just elevating above the base flood elevation is going to be your best option. But if you can combine that with some kind of floodproofing, that can be a good option for coming as close as possible to the minimum NFIP regulations.
Hi, Sarah. I'd like to interject. There's a question I think that is basically asking for clarification.
Oh, yeah.
So the question is, when you say damage potential, are you talking about possible damage to the structure or damage caused by the structure when it is
Both.
washed downstream?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, FEMA, generally, yeah, they're considering both damage to the structure and damage caused by the structure as damage potential. All right, so going to wrap up real quick, and then we can go to questions. I finished a little bit early, so we can have a long time for questions. All right. In summary, kind of what we've talked about today is make sure that all of your members are aware of the additional variance criteria for your community's floodplain ordinance, because there's some additional things aside from the minimum or from the variance criteria set by the state. You also want to remember that the purpose of floodplain regulations is to specifically address human safety and property protection in relation to a known and defined natural hazard. Keep in mind that the implications to both the community and the property owner and the neighboring properties if a variance is granted. You also want to document and keep on file any floodplain variances and seek guidance and assistance early, whether that's reaching out to us at OPD or FEMA, or we can refer you to FEMA. We are more than happy to help. I know FEMA's more than happy to help. They would really prefer people to do their due diligence and ask them all of the questions rather than just assuming things and end up creating a hazard. So we do have some resources on our webpage. We have sample model ordinances, we have trainings, we have recorded webinars, and also a lot of FEMA resource documents, which there are some listed right here. There is a specific document on floodplain variances for the NFIP, also floodplain management requirements for agricultural and accessory structures. So if you have any questions or you want to like actually look up what FEMA says, because ultimately like they are the ones who run the NFIP federally, so ultimately FEMA kind of has, they make up the rules. All right, so I'm going to leave our contact information here. And Ken, did we get any questions?
We do have one other question, which came a little bit earlier. Just asking, where can floodplain maps be found?
Oh, that is a great question. A couple different places depending on your preference. So there is something called the Map Service Center, that is msc.gov or msc.fema.gov. And that is where you can type in either an address or generally latitude and longitude coordinates. Thank you, Ken. Our latitude and longitude coordinates might work a little better because sometimes the maps don't exactly show an address in exactly where it's supposed to be. So just when you use those maps, double check that what that website is showing you is the address that you are looking for. There is also something called the National Flood Hazard Layer. It's almost identical to the Map Service Center. It's just based in ArcGIS. There is also a mapping website called the Flood Map Changes Viewer, and that is where you can look at what the proposed preliminary floodplain maps are from FEMA. So Stephanie said earlier that FEMA's in the process of updating all of the maps across the state. Different counties and watersheds are at different points in the development. So There are some watersheds which likely will be getting their maps this year, but then there's a lot of northern New Hampshire that likely will not be seeing a new map until 2027 or 2028.
And
I can
and
put,
what is the easiest way to access the National Flood Hazard Layer? Is there a specific website that you can tell people about?
I was about to put links for these in chat.
Cool.
Sorry, difficult for me to talk and type at the same time. Okay, so put the National Flood Hazard Layer in the chat, which is the ArcGIS web application. Then we have the Maps Service Center. Oh. It says new tab. That's supposed to be the Map Service Center. I apologize. It is a URL. And then we have the Flood Map Changes viewer. I hope that this one says what it is. Nope, that's also ArcGIS web application. Once during the break between the next session, I will try to fully type out in the chat exactly which one of these goes to what. So you all can have the links.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? It's there's time still. Please feel free to ask any of the questions that you have. Place them in the chat, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so the links are clickable on the slides, but unfortunately I was not anticipating the how do we view the maps question. I maybe should have to include those in the slide decks, but I will put those in the chat over our break. You can also find all of these links to our maps on our website. They should be under the resources tab. I just might need to dig just a little bit to find them.
We do have another question. How does FEMA view existing properties in the AE zone, but above the base flood elevation?
How do they view them? So, okay, I can interpret that question two ways. How do they view them is they use the maps, the websites that I just talked about, the Map Service Center. If you mean like how does FEMA interpret them, that is they depends on, so if your structure is fully elevated above the base flood elevation, like fully, there is a way that you can get a surveyor or an engineer to come give an elevation certificate to certify that says like, yes, my house is this high. And then you can go to FEMA and request what's called a letter of map change. And you will want to provide them with all of the elevation data and the surveying data that was done. And FEMA will then go in and revise the map and remove your structure from the floodplain. Now, that is FEMA will not do this just kind of by themselves. They need to be prompted by someone, and that person is expected to like pay for the surveying to justify why they think that the map should be revised, because it is a very long process. It can take many months to do that. But it is possible to get your house removed if you can document and show that it is well above the base flood elevation.
We do have just a follow-up to that question, which was how should variances be applied? Perhaps that's what the question was intending regarding the AE zone properties.
How variances are applied in well, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question, because I'm not exactly sure what the reason for granting a variance would be in an AE zone above the base flood elevation. Because generally what FEMA would want someone to do in that situation would be to go through the letter of map change process rather than going through a variance, if that's what you meant.
Okay. There we go. He says thanks. And we have another person who asked, did the question about damage potential get answered? And the answer I recall, Sarah, was that you said referring possible damage to the structure or damage caused by the structure. The answer to that is both. Do you have anything else you want to say about that?
No, well, I personally Stephanie and I are relatively new. We have not yet come across a variance request situation, so it is something that I think if I would need to maybe talk to FEMA to figure out specifically what they use for determining the exact damage potential. I know that they use construction materials. I know that they use location and use type. But yeah, I think that's a more detailed question that I would need to reach out to FEMA about.
Do we have any other questions? Oh. Okay. If not, if you're still typing, go ahead, keep typing. But otherwise, I want to thank Sarah and Stephanie for their presentation today. And hang on, of course, if and the session 4 will start at 2:15, which will be the question and answer session, where you can bring up any questions that you either wanted to ask or didn't get answered from the first 2 sessions of the day. So with that, thank you, everybody, and we will be back at 2:15.